Over the past couple of months, I've had a lot of American viewers and listeners tell me something that I wasn't expecting to hear. You get it. You understand us. You nailed it. And if I'm honest, those comments mean more to me than people probably realize. Because when I first moved here, there were plenty of moments when I wasn't sure I belonged here at all.
You better take cover.
One of the first moments happened not long after I arrived in Tennessee. Our realtor friend invited us to a Thanksgiving dinner. Now, if you're from overseas, being invited to Thanksgiving dinner feels a little bit like being invited into a movie that you've been watching your whole life. You've seen it on TV, you've heard people talk about it, but you've never actually experienced it. So off we went. And almost immediately, I felt completely out of place. And most of the guests worked in what Nashville locals simply call the industry. There were stylists, musicians, producers, people who seemed far more interesting than an Aussie who had just arrived from the other side of the world. And people kept asking how we knew the hosts. Well, we bought a house through one of them, which was technically correct, even though we'd actually known them for years, probably longer than half the people that were at the party. Now, at one point, I introduced myself to someone who turned out to be a local DJ, and his response was, so you're the Australian. And it was accompanied by what I could only describe as a bit of a look of disappointment. And maybe he was expecting Steve Irwin. I don't know. Either way, I remember standing there and I was thinking, yeah, that's me, the Australian, the outsider, the guy who didn't really know anybody, the guy trying to work out where he actually fit in. If I'm honest, after that conversation, I was ready to leave the dinner. We hadn't even seen the turkey yet. It was one of those moments that reminds you you're not home anymore. Everybody else seemed to know each other. Everybody else seemed to know what the rules were. Now, the funny thing is that Thanksgiving dinner wasn't the whole story. We also had neighbours who welcomed us. My wife, Nikki, she joined a mother's group and still has friends from those early days. Our realtor invited us to Thanksgiving in the first place. So it's not as though everyone was standing around with scorecards deciding whether we belonged. Most people were just people. Some made us feel welcome. Some made us feel awkward. And when you've just moved to another country, you typically notice it all. Every conversation, an invitation, every awkward moment, every sign that maybe you're starting to find your place. And looking back now, what surprises me probably isn't so much the awkward moments, it's how many people seemed determined to make room for us. And I think that's one reason why your comments have stayed with me. Because 8 years ago, I was still trying to work out whether I even belonged here. Now people are telling me they're glad that I do. And that's not something I ever expected to hear. And when you really think about it, the funny thing is, I don't think Americans always realize that they're even doing it. But over the years, I've noticed something. Americans have a habit of adopting people. Now, it's not literally, there's no paperwork involved in any of this. But if you stick around long enough, people do start inviting you in. And they remember your name. They remember your kids. They ask where you've been if they haven't seen you for a while. And one day, you realize that you're no longer the outsider that's looking through the window. You're actually part of the conversation. Now, a good example is the lady at our local Publix bakery. Now, my girls are 10 and 7 now. She still remembers them. Every time we walk past, she asks how they're doing. She remembers cakes she made for birthdays years ago. Sometimes she has cookies already waiting for them before they've even asked. Now, maybe that's normal here, and maybe no one else thinks twice about it, but I still do. Because where I come from, that's not the sort of relationship I'd expect to have with most people who work at the supermarket. Yet somehow she's become part of our lives. Then there's a local hardware store. I've been going there long enough now that people recognize me, which is probably slightly concerning because I've reached the age where I apparently have opinions about lawn care. I've had people ask me questions about moles. Those ugly little furry things that dig tunnels through your yard. And if you told me 20 years ago that one day I'd be standing in Nashville discussing mole damage with complete seriousness, I would have assumed I'd taken some strange turns in life. But here we are. And somewhere along the way, those places stopped feeling like businesses that I visited, and they started feeling familiar. And a bit like the community itself. My girls are probably the best example of all. Georgia was almost 3 when we moved here, young enough that most of her memories are American memories. And Brianna, well, she was born here, so she's never known anything else. And when I look at their lives now, it's hard to imagine there was ever a time when we were the new family trying to find our feet. Because they have school friends, and dance friends, and neighborhood friends. They know exactly where they belong. In fact, they probably think that I'm the strange one. Georgia still feels connected to Australia because she was born there, but America is where she's growing up. And Brianna, well, she's about as Tennessee as sweet tea and saying, I'm fixing to get your britches. None of them spend much time wondering whether they fit in. That question was answered a long time ago for them. Maybe that's part of what's been on my mind lately. Because when people write things like, you get it, or we're glad you're here, they're saying something my daughters have never really had to think about. They're saying, you belong here. And for someone who arrived from the other side of the world 8 years ago, that's still a pretty remarkable thing to hear. And one of the comments that stayed with me was from somebody who wrote, we're glad you're here. And that's a simple sentence, but it's also a really powerful one because there was no requirement attached to it, no test, no checklist, no expectation that I had to become somebody else first. It was just, we're glad you're here. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I've heard versions of that sentence for years, and not always with words, because sometimes it was an invitation or a neighbor stopping for a chat. Sometimes with somebody remembering your kids' names just years later. But it's the same message. You don't have to stand outside looking in. Come join us. Now, I don't know exactly why Americans do this. Maybe it's because almost everybody's family came from somewhere else at some point. And maybe it's because America is one of the few places where asking someone, where are you from, isn't automatically a question about where they were born. Or maybe it's even simpler than that. Maybe a country full of people whose families were once the newcomers gets pretty good at recognizing the newcomer standing in front of them. Whatever the reason is, I know what it felt like from my side. Because 8 years ago, I was a bloke standing at a Thanksgiving dinner wondering where I fit. And these days, I'm an American citizen. Somewhere between those 2 points, America stopped feeling like a place that I lived, and it started feeling like home. And maybe that's the funny part, because for years I've been making videos about Americans making room for people, inviting people in, making room at the table, helping people feel welcome. Only recently did I realize they've been doing it for me the whole time, in conversation by conversation, neighbor by neighbor. Until one day I looked around and realized that I wasn't the newcomer anymore. One of the things I've come to appreciate about America isn't that everybody thinks the same. It's that people can arrive here as themselves and still find a place to belong. And for an Australian who came here knowing almost no one, that's something I'll always be grateful for. And judging by those comments, I suspect a lot of Americans don't even realize that they're doing it. It's just who you are. I think that's one of the most American things that I've experienced. If you'd like more conversations like this, I publish a weekly podcast called This Week in America, where I share some of the things I've been noticing, learning, and occasionally misunderstanding as an Aussie living here in the US. New episodes come out every Thursday. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can also find me on Buy Me a Coffee. Links for all of that in the description. Hooroo, mateys.
You better take cover.